Greetings. Wow, this is terrific. Thank you all for being here. Welcome to the Manchester Community Library. My name is Gay Symington. I'm a volunteer on the Board of Trustees of Vermont Digger, and Rob Wilmington and I, who's the vice president, I always say the title wrong, is from Bennington, and he will be joining me in just welcoming you and getting things started. I got some logistics. One is the food and drink I hope you saw is in the back room, and that will be available throughout the event. Feel free to get up if you would like. There's also bathrooms at that door. Please turn off your cell phones. And Northshire Books is selling signed books that Jill signed before we got started in that front entranceway, and they'll be here really to the bitter end, as Jessica said. I have lots of, to pull off an event like this takes lots and lots of legwork, and and help, and donors, and I want to thank some folks. First of all, I want to thank Jill, who said, how can I help Digger? I'd love to do an event. And thank you so much with the zillion, bajillion other ways that you... Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to the Manchester Community Library. Their staff has been incredibly gracious, helping us figure out how the setup and getting us getting started. Northshire Bookstore, also incredibly helpful. Both the library and the bookstore have been promoting the event. We're really excited about the event, hosting the event in Manchester. So thank you to both organizations for their work. There are several donors who I won't name so that others don't jump all over them right away, but who contributed to the food portion so that we could, little old nonprofit Vermont Digger minimize its costs. So thank you to those donors, and thank you to all of the donors in the room. It is by paying for the news that we keep truth and fact-checked journalism in front of people. So thank you very much, all of you who contribute. There are several members of Digger's board who are here. We put in lots of time and energy and ideas, probably more ideas than the staff would be happy if we came up with a few fewer ideas occasionally. Well, they tolerate us pretty well. John Riley, Carolyn Mube, Sue Halpern, Rob Wilmington, and myself. I believe we are the board members who are here tonight. And then the work really that it's why we're all here is the people who are out finding the stories, writing the stories, editing the stories, and publishing the stories. Thank you to the newsroom, led by Paul Heinz, now, newly our managing editor, Neil Goswami, and then Ethan Weinstein and Sean Robinson and Glenn Russell are here from the newsroom. So their work is really important. They're out there every day making sure that what goes up on our website the facts have been checked, and you can count on it. So thank you. And then there are just a couple of people who really are key to making this event happen. Florencio greeted you as you walked in, and then none of this would be happening without the star of the show, Dustin Byerly. She's kept us all on track. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob. Thank you again for being here.
Yeah, good evening. Again, I'm Rob Wilmington, and I live in Bennington. And it's great to have an event for Vermont Digger here in Bennington County. As many of you may remember, our late Senator Dick Sears said that in Montpelier, Bennington is known as the Forgotten Kingdom. And that hasn't been really true for a while, but one of the great things that Vermont Digger does is it not only brings the news of northern Vermont to us, but it brings the news of southern Vermont to the rest of the state. And I think it helps integrate and make us more part of the state. And I'm very happy about that, and we want to continue that work. I'm really here to introduce our CEO, Skye Barsh, and I want to say just a brief couple words about her before we start. I was on the search committee to find a successor to Ann Galloway, our terrific founder and incredibly able and visionary person who started VTDigger herself and built it up to a much larger organization. And when we had to think about who could succeed Ann, we decided that we really should break up or divide the responsibilities. Ann did everything, was responsible for everything, to a CEO and to an editor-in-chief. We had a terrific editor-in-chief in place of Paul Heinz at that time. But we really needed to find someone who could make the organization strong and resilient and a platform to do the sort of work we aspire to do. And when we talked about it, we were looking for some particular qualifications that we hoped to find in a person. We did a national search, but we hoped we might find someone who knew something about Vermont, maybe a lot about Vermont. It wasn't essential, but it was important to think about. We needed someone who knew digital media and was comfortable in digital media because we are a digital platform only. We needed someone who had experience in building revenue and using digital platforms to build revenue. And we really hoped to have someone who had worked as a journalist in a newsroom, though that's now a metaphor rather than a physical description, but somebody who knew how the news got out and was put together. But there was one essential that we really knew we needed, and that was someone who understood the role that local journalism, regional journalism plays in building a strong civic culture and a democratic system. We needed someone who understood that and who could articulate that and carry that message forward. And we ended up hiring a Vermonter, who is not a native, but someone who's lived here for several decades, has lived in 4 counties in Vermont. Skye worked for the Free Press at one point. She was involved in digital media at The Nation in New York and in the transformative time at Vermont Life. She worked for Chalkbeat, which is a national digital educational news service. And she articulated to us very clearly her understanding of the role that newspapers and news organizations play in keeping a vibrant civic culture. So we're delighted to have hired her, and here she is.
I did say in my interview process that I am not a natural public speaker, so, but thank you. It is so nice to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. It's really, really nice to be here. I am a proud graduate of Castleton, so this part of the state is my, thank you. This part of the state was my first home in Vermont, and it's very special to me. So thank you for having me this evening. So as Robin Gay said, I'm the Chief Executive Officer at VTDigger, and in my role, I have the distinct privilege of working with 30 individuals who produce the journalism and stand up the operation that makes Digger what it is. We are Vermont's most in-depth, statewide, nonpartisan, nonprofit news organization, and all those words are very important to me. I'm honored to lead Digger because I have a passion for journalism. I believe so strongly in civic participation, and I really love and believe in Vermont. So VTDigger, we're committed to truth, to accuracy, and to fairness. But what does that mean? It means we have to ask questions of public officials, perhaps some of you in this room, that are sometimes uncomfortable. But that means there's a check on power, as there should be in a strong, healthy democracy. It means we let you know when injustices occur, especially to vulnerable people. such as our recent story about a school in Pulteney that closed after investigations found a series of troubling occurrences. It means we follow what's happening in the legislature, and that's not because we care about the horse race politics. It's because the decisions that get made in those small committee rooms have an outside impact on communities like Manchester. The policy changes in the legislature affect Vermonters' ability to start businesses, to afford housing, to have access to quality education, and to safely swim and fish in our streams and our rivers. What VTDigger does also means that we get to tell the full picture of Vermont, the stories that make us who we are and what works, like our recent piece about a police officer and a community healthcare worker who have teamed up to make evening visits to the woods and other remote areas to check on the well-being of unhoused residents. It means that we publish for free obituaries that share the lives lived of our friends and our neighbors. It means we devote the editing, fact-checking, and curating of a variety of opinion pieces so our community has a place to discuss the issues that matter to them, and our readers can trust that even in an opinion pieces, the facts have been checked out. It means that we allow 14 small community news organizations to publish any of our content for free. So we're supporting small news organizations who are often struggling, and we're supporting readers who access the news in those ways. I'd like to again point out the folks in this room who make this all possible, and if you could stand or give a wave. Paul Heinz is our editor-in-chief. He leads our news coverage in the newsroom. Neil Goswami. Neil Goswami, who's our new managing editor and Bennington native. Sean Robinson. There's Sean. He's our state government and economy reporter. Ethan Weinstein, our education and corrections reporter. Glenn Russell. There he is. Our staff photographer. Dustin Byerly, again, who really had such a huge hand in making this evening possible. Our director of major gifts. Florencio Terra. Florencio, he is our longest tenured team member. He might be out in the hallway, but he's our membership manager. A lot of you may have communicated with him on email or on the phone about your membership. Our volunteer board of directors who volunteer, I know you're not supposed to say countless, but it truly is countless hours. They do so much, not just for us as an organization, but for our state, ensuring that Vermont Digger exists. And Gay Symington, our board chair, she also put so much work into making this evening so special, so thank you, Gay. And I'd like to thank everybody in this room who contributes financially to make this work possible. We literally could not do it without you. That's how it happened, so thank you. When I look around this room, I see that you have all made a choice to take time out of your busy schedule to be here, a choice to participate in creating our story, our state, our nation, our history, and our future. Tonight, we are in a room of people who know that even and especially when our democracy feels threatened, it's up to us to resist apathy and to do our part to build a more perfect union. Tonight, we have the perfect guest to inform and inspire us on this quest. We are so thrilled and honored to welcome our esteemed speaker, Jill Lepore, an expert on American history, a professor at Harvard University, and a staff writer at my favorite magazine. There is an issue in every single room in my house of The New Yorker. Jill's brilliant research and writing remind us that American democracy is very much a work in progress. Her work delves into the history of ideas, institutions, and the role of information in shaping society. This deeply resonates with us at Digger, where our mission is not just to report the news, but to ensure Vermonters are informed participants in our democracy. I'm almost done with these truths, and I urge you to read this if you have not yet. It is fascinating, it is infuriating, it's instructive, and it is so beautifully written. And if you like audiobooks, she narrates it, and it's fantastic. Like Joe, we believe that understanding the past is key to navigating the present. Whether we are investigating a school closure or tracking decisions made in the legislature, we know that journalism, like history, is about making connections and uncovering the truths that shape our communities. And that the concept of a free press, free from influence, and in our case, free to read, thanks to all your support, is foundational to democracy's success. It is my absolute privilege and honor to introduce and welcome our guest of honor, Jill Lepore.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I really can't say enough how much I am honored by the opportunity to speak on an occasion that celebrates the work that VTDigger does in this beautiful state. There could be nothing more crucial to do than to provide the kind of investigative reporting that the Digger provides, and also the community that it offers to its readers, that sense of belonging that you get when you click on that webpage and you read about the experiences of people across the state and feel a sense of connection. I know I started reading the Digger during the pandemic, to be honest, and it really meant something particularly important to me then in those days, to feel that sense of shared experience in a time of great isolation. And I think it's an often overlooked piece of what newspapers and good journalism does, is help you to sense your shared humanity. And in the case of an organization like the Digger, which is a statewide publication, your sense of belonging to a state, which is a thing we don't often think about. We talk a lot about being Americans, or maybe even being from Bennington. I don't really have much of a county identity, but I think that sense of being a Vermonter is something that I live in Brattleboro, I really get from the Digger in a way that I don't really have statewide publications that I read. So I just wanted to say, with, in the truest sense, what an honor it is for me to be here with you. And especially fun to be here in a public library, which, second only to a local newspaper or a public school, is my favorite institution. So I do really genuinely want to thank the library for hosting this event. I'm here to talk about history. I'm supposed to be a historian, so I am going to talk about history. But I can't help but remark that, so my parents were both public school teachers, and we also had a family newspaper route. And my parents both worked for the local paper as side gigs. We had a lot of side hustles in my family because we were always trying to make ends meet. And my mother was the art director for our local paper and also the sole business reporter, which just meant that she would go to the local pet shop when it opened up and do a profile of the pet store owner or the parrot at the store. She would do a profile piece. And my dad, whose name was Frank Lepore, he wrote an opinion column called Frankly Speaking, which was basically like grumpy Andy Rooney. Do you remember when Andy Rooney would say, and another thing? That was like my Frankly Speaking. That was my dad's column. So we delivered the newspaper, but my parents also kind of privately ran it. So I really care about what local news means, what local schools mean, what local public schools mean, what public libraries mean, what a town means to the people who live in a town. And it's a thing that I love about Vermont because I still feel those things here, that sense of belonging to a place, to a land, and to a people. But enough of my sentimentality. I thought I would talk for a few minutes. I'm just going to give you a very brief history of news in the United States. And then we're going to have a chance to chat. Because mainly I want to hear from all of you and answer questions and have a much more kind of informal occasion. But I think the title of the evening is Democracy, News, and History. And I want to make sure that everyone understands how crucial news has been to the founding of modern American democracy. We wouldn't have a democracy in the United States without newspapers. Newspapers built American democracy, and it is a real question whether democracy continues if newspapers do not. And I want to just kind of illustrate that by putting on my professorial hat and sketching out a little bit of history. So newspapers were invented as a form, as a genre, in the 17th century. The first newspaper in English was the London Gazette, published in 1665. The word gazette comes from the Italian word gazzetta. Gazzetta is a Venetian coin, and it was just what you paid to buy a sheet of news that you could buy on the street. But a gazette in English mainly meant a bunch of rumors, because newspapers, when they were started, they were just like rumor sheets. But a gazette came to be known as a paper bullet, because increasingly people printed newspapers in order to hold people in power into account for their actions. And so there was this sense of that the power of print could be found in these news sheets. Some of them were newsletters. Most of them were not newspapers in anything that we would note. The London Gazette had on its masthead published by authority, which meant that everything in it had to be approved by the Crown. And that notion of what a newspaper is was brought over to the colonies by English colonists to British North America, that to publish the news, you had to gain a license from the government. And the government would therefore, de facto, have control over what you printed. So the first newspaper printed in the colonies, in the English colonies, was published in Boston in 1690. It was called Public Occurrences, and it was only published for one issue, because in the spirit of being a gossip sheet, there was a very funny story in it about the King of France having been cuckolded. And the Massachusetts government shut it down. They just for fear of what else might lie ahead. So the next newspaper, the Boston Newsletter, was published starting in 1704, and it was published by authority. And it really just only printed stuff that, really, Massachusetts was a theocracy at the time, that was approved by the ministry and the government of Massachusetts. It was Benjamin Franklin's older brother, James Franklin, who started the first newspaper in the colonies that was published without authority. It was called the New England Current, and it's very funny. It's genuinely an extremely funny newspaper. It's full of satire and quite veiled attacks on the Puritan elite. James Franklin was sent to prison for sedition 3 times. And so that joke about the French king being cuckolded was like light stuff compared to what James Franklin was willing to print. And each time he went to prison, his younger brother, Benjamin Franklin, who was his apprentice, printed the paper and had to put it out under his own name because James Franklin was prohibited from ever again publishing a newspaper. So Benjamin Franklin imbibed this sense that what a newspaper's purpose was, which was a kind of new idea by then, now we're in the 1720s, that a newspaper's purpose was, in fact, to hold people in power to account. The Franklins just thought the best way to do that was to make fun of them. But that was what they considered to be the whole point of a newspaper. Publishing a newspaper published by authority, licensed by the government, seemed to be completely counterintuitive to the Franklins. And that's the tradition on which the freedom of the press, as it came to be celebrated and defended and fought for in the 18th century, was based. And so by the time you get to the struggle with Parliament that leads to the American Revolution, it's really the stamp tax of 1765, which is a tax on printers. And the thing that printers are mostly printing and making their money off of is the newspaper. So the stamp tax was Parliament's way of trying to shut up colonial printers who were complaining about other taxes, the sugar tax, for instance. So the stamp tax was a tax on printers, and it was the colonial objection to it and the resistance to it. Printers just held funerals for their newspapers in 1765. They printed like black pages, and they carried Liberty in a casket down streets, and they buried her with the last issue of the newspaper in 1765 to make the claim, to illustrate through these pretty funny spectacles, because printers are pretty funny, to illustrate that if the newspaper died, that Liberty would die with it, and they would throw Liberty in the same casket as the last issue of the newspaper. It was those protests that allowed the colonists to convince Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. it was the continued effort to suppress the freedom of expression that led to the American Revolution. So the very country whose 250th anniversary we're soon to be commemorating, the very country was born with the commitment to a free press. And without that commitment, we would not have a free country. That notion of freedom is a part of the nation's founding that I think really ought to be very much at the center of how we think about this forthcoming 250th anniversary. So what's interesting, people tend to not think that, people have the idea that the press was always aspirationally nonpartisan, but presses in the 18th century were all partisan, and the newspapers were all partisan. And how the freedom of the press worked was what Benjamin Franklin liked to say, the way you get to the truth is the truth and lies battle on a fair field, and truth will always win. So if you had many newspapers and they had different positions, they would just fight it out. And eventually readers would be like, these people are clearly wrong. That it was actually the conflict between printing presses and their different partisan positions that modeled for the country what political party battles would be. That contest of ideas, that's how parties struggle with one another, that how we kind of arrive at a better society, is actually something that comes from printers just kind of duking it out. That's how early printing presses worked. Newspapers grew at 4 times the rate of the population in the early decades of the country. By the 1820s and 30s, you see daily newspapers for the first time, a penny press, and that's at the time when for the first time, all white men can vote without owning any property. This was known as universal suffrage, which is kind of funny to us. But universal suffrage meant that all white men could vote, which was not true anywhere else in the world. And the reason that was possible was the newspaper, because newspapers only cost a penny. Anybody could afford a penny. Anybody could be informed enough to cast an informed vote. That's what fueled the democratization of American politics in the 1820s and 1830s. Not Andrew Jackson and speeches that he gave. The reduction in cost of the daily newspaper was what made it possible for more Americans to vote. And that has always been the case throughout the subsequent history of journalism in the United States. Journalism first comes to be called journalism when newspapers can be daily. It's the jour in journalism. And so you have the word changes, the idea changes. By the end of the 19th century, journalism has become professionalized. And there's a whole new commitment to nonpartisan writing as an aspiration, and a different kind of commitment to evidence and to sources. The founding of what we think of as modern journalism really is a kind of late 19th century, early 20th century development. And one of the things that's really interesting about it, it's quite informed by the social sciences and quantitative research and the scientific method. And so newspapers become deeply committed to revealing their sources. They have new rules about sources. So for instance, by 1925, when the New Yorker is founded, the New Yorker is just about to celebrate its 100th anniversary, it establishes a fact-checking department. That is a new idea in the United States. It's a new idea in journalism. It comes out of the First World War and the way in which so many people felt lied to over the coverage of the First World War. Fact-checking is a kind of post-World War I innovation. It really transforms journalism. So does radio broadcasting and new ideas about the radio as a public utility and a commitment to broadcasting licensing as a way that the government can participate in and ensure the availability of information through the broadcasting network of the radio and later of television. The antecedents of what comes to be the fairness doctrine after television is invented, that's adopted in 1949. So there's this incredibly rich tradition of the commitment to making the best news reporting free, available to the greatest number of people, having it be accountable to evidence, the understanding that this kind of work is necessary for democratic society, for civil society. There's the revolution after revolution in this industry. One of the things that happens in the 1950s is that television begins reporting the news nightly. And when television reports the news nightly, daily papers that come out in the morning don't have enough news to report anymore. And you'd think that would be a big crisis for newspapers, but it's not, because what it means is that when people get up in the morning in the 1960s to read the newspaper, they've watched the news the night before, they kind of know what happened. What they go to newspapers for is a deeper investigation, a more powerful analysis, a more thoughtful set of commentaries that they could get, that the TV news organizations are doing great work putting together stories. What happened today? But what the newspaper does the next day is, what did it mean? Why should you care? What might happen next? Let me tell you more about that. And the newspaper world enters this incredible golden age in the 60s and 70s, that kind of intensive adversarial reporting that you associate with coverage of the Vietnam War, the coverage of Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, all of that 60s and 70s reporting is made possible by the fact that television is doing something different, and newspapers and news magazines make tremendous leaps in holding people in power at a time of tremendous corruption in American life, holding people in power to account. The world that we live in today is shaped by all of those sequences. This is what I'm going to sound like the newspapers don't come out of a coconut tree. But the world that we live in today of news is shaped by all of those developments, but also by a series of crises since then. In the 70s and 80s, newspapers were bought up by corporations. Many of them were shut down. There was a great consolidation and conglomeration, especially of local papers. A lot of papers, like the paper I delivered as a kid, really suffered in those eras. They're bought by foreign corporations. Well before you get to the 1980s and cable news and the end of the fairness doctrine and developments that we think of as having been pivotal to later history of the news, newspapers suffered greatly economically. We're in a different era now that you could kind of date to the rise of social media. And the proliferation of different outlets for news, the rise of kind of citizen journalism through internet reporting. We are all familiar with that history, so I'm not kind of going to go over it. But it is in the landscape that we live in now that I think what the Digger is doing is so important, because it draws from the best of each of the earlier traditions, that a newspaper should be free, that it should be reported by people who are carefully trained to be responsible and ethical, to be accurate, to be fair, to be nonpartisan, to do their very best to bring to the public mind, to a public awareness, to a community of readers, to a community that needs a civic space where they can find reliable news that will be holding people in power to account. The best of each of those traditions that are accumulated over the course of American history are represented in what the Digger does now. So I really hope that in coming to this evening's event, you've also committed yourself to supporting the Digger. And I want to note the VR code right here, because I am here to raise money for this tremendous organization, and I hope that people coming here tonight was a tremendous contribution. But I hope that you will also find other ways to support the Digger and all that it does. So, Paul, I'd be happy to sit down and chat now.
Thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciate you being here and supporting VTDigger. We were so thrilled when we learned through hearing you on a podcast, actually, that you were asked a question after speaking at some length about all the things that was going wrong in our democracy. You were asked, what's one thing that made you feel optimistic? And your answer was something along the lines of the rise of nonprofit news media, and then you specifically shout out VTDigger, and we in our newsroom were all like, whoa, because we didn't know you were living part-time in Southern Vermont, and we were so thrilled to hear that you were a reader, and we thank you so much for being here today. We want to make sure that you all have a chance to ask questions, and we are happy to, we have Skies back up here, and we would love to answer your questions about wait, it's no longer up there. News, democracy, these perilous times. There we go. Thank you, Dustin. And we'll have Dustin. Do you have a microphone? I'll hand you mine. Great. Dustin will be going around the room to make sure that you can ask your questions. But since I have the microphone for the moment, am going to use it to ask the first question. And I was going to ask a question about these weighty topics. But the thing that I wonder the most about Jill is how you do all that you do. I feel like, if you seem to have like 6 different jobs, as a professor, as an author, as a journalist, and very frequent contributor to New Yorker, as a podcast host. And I think about if I was doing one of those things, I'd barely get it done. So I was wondering if you might share a little bit about the way that you work and how you do all of this. You write in the introduction to your latest collection of essays that you really love the deadline, which some of us do, some of us don't. Some of our reporters do, and some of them don't. I'm curious, though, if you could tell us sort of how you do what you do, and then we'll hand it off to everyone else for questions.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And in terms of the scope of question, you could ask anything. This is, that like Reddit thing, AMA, ask me anything. This can be an AMA. Most of what I do overlaps with everything else that I do. There's a lot of overlap between the kinds of things I like to write about and the things I tend to be teaching about, something I want to think about, stuff I've been reading about. So there's a lot of synergy, and there's also, I have found that writing for The New Yorker, say, has really helped me think more clearly about how to put together a lecture for an undergraduate class. Like, what's the story that might be grabby? Like I remember, the example I often give is like, I remember once I was asked by The New Yorker to write a piece on the history of taxation. I just thought, I'm sorry, there's no way that can be interesting. Like, I'm already bored and I didn't even answer the email yet. Like, that's the most boring thing. And it took me quite a while. It's interesting to me. Like, I read a lot of books about the history of taxation. I found some things interesting about it. Most of it I found fairly boring. And I ended up coming up with this lead that was about, because I didn't really realize that the 16th Amendment, which makes possible the federal graduated income tax in 1913, was set in motion in many significant ways by the San Francisco earthquake of, I think, 1906. And the earthquake's a great story. Earthquake's a great lead. Everybody would be like, okay, great, an earthquake. Like, things are falling, and then the bank collapses. Nobody can get their money because the banks are all local. And that's what creates the Federal Reserve. It's like it's a huge financial crisis because there's so much money in San Francisco, like actual physical money and currency. And so I was like, all right, I can make this interesting because I can start with an earthquake. But that's the kind of the move you would make in a classroom, too, if you're giving a lecture. I'm like, I didn't say anything interesting at the start of my little lecture. I didn't think of a good story. But there's a lot of synergy with that. The more practical sort of like time management thing, I often say, has to do with being a parent. Because when I had my first 2 kids very quickly together, and I didn't have tenure, and I was teaching, and one of my kids hardly ever slept, and I just got into this thing with like, if they were both asleep, or someone, like my husband was taking them for a walk, like I could just turn on that I had to do, grade papers, that I would do them all, or I'd write the lecture, or whatever I had to do. And then I could also turn it off and like put it in a storage thing where I could turn it back on. Like, so I could develop, and of course all parents have some version of this, but like this, like, oh my God, he's gonna only sleep for 30 minutes. I have to run, I have to finish this chapter. Whereas like I have to finish this chapter. I wonder what Sally's doing. What she need for coffee? I think maybe I'll go for a run. I was thinking, actually, the bathtub's gross. I'm going to wash the bathroom. Like the things that you would normally do to not write the chapter. And before kids, I would do all those. Maybe not wash the bathtub, but I would do those things instead of writing the chapter. But then I just got this very like hyper focus thing. That was kind of a weird gift of motherhood.
Thank you. Great. Justin, you have a question back there. Great, go ahead. And please, introduce yourself before asking your question if you would. Thank you.
Sure. My name is Michael Martin. I'm the executive director of the Rowland Foundation and professor. In these truths, you have some great critiques of polls. And if I see another poll these days, so in these unprecedented times, when we're swimming in horse race journalism and polls, I was wondering if you could speak to the validity, reliability, problems of polls.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. Some of that, I think I pitched a piece in 2015. People might not remember this, but maybe you do. It seems so long ago. In 2015, there was going to be the GOP primary debate, and there were like 20 Republicans running for the nomination. So remember they were going to have like the main stage and then the kiddie table, and the kiddie table was going to be not at prime time. And then the first debate was going to be hosted by Fox News. And Fox News, trying to decide what to do with all of these candidates, decided they would use polls to decide who was where, and then in which table, but then also where they were on the stage. And so they did an average of 4 polls, and that meant that Trump, who had the name recognition, was in the middle at the grown-up table. And they used the polls also to proportion out the amount of time and the number of questions that each candidate would have. This was like, 400 days before the election. Of the 17 candidates, or however many they were, Trump and Jeb Bush were the only ones that anybody had heard of. So it had this huge effect on people's experience of the primary. And notably, although this was not very widely reported, the legitimate polling organizations all refused to participate. Gallup, Pew, NBC, Wall Street Journal said, that is no way to decide what happens in a debate. Do you understand that you're creating a poll result? You're using polls to generate a poll result. Because of course, the only thing that people do the debates for is to change their poll standing. So, that's what at this point, that's what the racket is. You do well enough in the polls to be in the debate so that you can do better in the polls. That's how our politics now works. So I said to my editor, I think maybe I really want to write a piece about the polls. And the other thing is, so there's a lot to say, so we can just acknowledge, I think, that's a contortion of the process. There are many other kinds of contortions. Maybe that's not worth losing sleep over. But what seemed to me interesting was that polls were, and they still are, they're less reliable than they've been ever before, and yet we rely on them more than ever before. They're less reliable because they require landlines, for one thing, and people don't have landlines. And so when polling started, of the so-called scientific polling that started in the 1930s, when George Gallup started the American Institute for Public Opinion in 1935, his response rate, he had people go knock on doors and talk to people. His response was well above 90%. The response rate now is below 5%. So what polling organizations do, because so few people, if anybody called, I would never answer a poll. People just hang up. I never even answer my phone. Most people don't even have a landline. And it's very hard to get anybody to answer. They just weight the answers that they do have. And so parts of the population that are very unlikely to have, segments of the population that are just statistically less likely to have a phone, let's say, like a young Hispanic man living in an urban area, not very likely to have a landline, answer the phone, take the time to answer the questions. So you get a small number of such people, and then you weight them in proportion to their population. So the distortion is greater, right? Elderly people who live in the suburbs are much more likely to participate. They're polling. I don't need to explain why, but the polls suck, I think what I was trying to say. The question is, what's the damage? I think actually the problem with polls is not that they're unreliable. The problem is the role that they play in our political process. So there was a tremendous amount of work done in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, to abolish the political machine, like the Boss-Tweed political machine, where party operators would essentially buy votes, buy whole communities, and the spoil system where then they would reward precinct people with political appointments, right? The political machine. The whole progressive era reform, good government reform was about abolishing the political machine and trying to have a healthy and representative political process. Out of that came the primary system. Primaries were invented in this era. Out of that came the direct election of the US Senate instead of previously the state legislatures elected your Senate. Like, there are a lot of really interesting reforms to try to make government more responsive to the people. But what happened by the 1930s was that polls started replacing the machinery. And so we now have this system that is as distorting as the political machine was of our political processes, and we weirdly don't have any movement. There's no political movement to stop relying on the polls. Other countries don't allow campaign polling until like 2 weeks before the election because it completely distorts it. There are plenty of countries who are just against the law. It'd be a violation of campaign law to do something like decide who's going to participate in a debate or where they're going to stand or how many questions they're going to get based on polls. Certainly not, a year and a half before the election. So I'm a little bit baffled by, I know a lot of people it's a billions of dollar industry, people make a lot of money off polls, I recognize that. But the piece of it that also really concerns the last thing, I'm sorry, I said I would give long answers. It used to be, between 1935, when modern polling started, and 1975, news organizations did not participate in polling. They also generally didn't report on it. Like Gallup had a column called America Talks, where he would give poll results. It was a syndicated column. But the newspapers that he published the column in didn't do polling. But in 1975, CBS decided for the first time to team with, I don't know, I think maybe it was Roper or something, and participate in polling. And a lot of people at media ethics people said, news organizations can't participate in polling. Like, you're supposed to find the news, not make it. Like, that's making the news in order to get readers to read your newspaper. Like, look, we did a poll. And everybody does it now. Like, NPR does polling. It was considered completely unethical when it started. And no one blinks at that. It's a big part of how news organizations spend their money during a campaign season, since we're always campaigning, is the era of the permanent campaign. Just the thing that bothers me about polling is it's one of those things that just seems to me so wrong, and yet no one complains. People complain that my sort of polls suck thing, but people don't complain that it's unethical, and that worries me.
And your money to VTDigger will not go toward polling. Dustin, who's next?
So when Bob Standard, Manchester, Vermont. In 2016, we had a presidential candidate come on the scene and coined 2 words that have seemed to have dominated American journalism and our society, and that's fake news. Could you just speak to the impact of those 2 words?
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that there was what can fairly be called an emerging epistemological crisis well before that. So you will recall that it was in 2005. Remember when Stephen Colbert had his own show? He would do that satirical, like fake Bill O'Reilly opening, and he would often have like a word of the week. And there was a day where he did the word of the week was truthiness. And it's a very funny, I use it in class all the time. I show the clip, but he's like, I don't think with my head, I think with my heart, and it was a kind of, it was a consequence of the revelation that the weapons of mass destruction that had been so, like Colin Powell had got up in front of the American people and said, we have irrefutable evidence that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. We therefore need to, engage in this war. That was wrong, that was a con. I don't think Powell is considered to have been responsible for the con, but that was a con. That was fake news. And it was people that wanted to defend it said, well, it's kind of true. Like, he's a very bad guy, and he did use chemical weapons against his own people. And we really want to fight the war. That Bush administration's defense of it was so mealy-mouthed and weaselly. That's where Colbert was like, that's what truthiness is. When you just want something to be true, and so it's kind of true. And it was so just to remind you that there was a lot of instability around how do we know who to believe about what. And I think we tend to put far too much emphasis on Trumpism as the scourge for all. Like, Trump wasn't responsible for being in the center of that stage. For instance, my story in which he benefits from this weird, completely unaccountable use of polls is not at all about Trump. Just this week in class, with the first day of class yesterday, I showed this clip that I thought about bringing tonight, but I didn't really figure out if I could connect my computer. It stressed me out. There's this very funny ad from the 1956 presidential campaign. It was a television spot. And it's an ad produced by the Eisenhower campaign, which hired like the top-notch Madison Avenue advertising company. And it's a little cartoon. And this little like cute cartoon man is saying, he has this kind of squeaky voice, he's bald, and he says, television, radio, magazines, newspapers, lower taxes, higher taxes, foreign invasion, the Korean War in Korea. Who to believe? What to believe? I don't know. What are the facts? How can I tell? That's my impression of the guy. So, I guarantee you, if you go watch the ad, that is so spot on. It's very, very cute, but I showed it to the students because I wanted to say, you know how people tell you your generation is uniquely unable to contend with the many different sources of news and information and the world of fake news and algorithmic feeds and how do you know what's true? Lower taxes, higher taxes, how can I tell? Like, that was 70 years ago. You know, that is, I don't know, there's just too many sources of news and I can't sift between them. And you know what? That's your job. That is your job. That's your job. That's what it is to be a citizen. That's your job. It's not the job of news organizations. It's your job to sift between sources of information and make good choices. Now, as a young person, I'm giving you my scolding lecture to the 18-year-old. That's hard to do, but like, I don't know, you got it into Harvard, like you can figure that out. Like you're gonna figure it out. Like it's challenging. It's maybe more challenging now than it was in 1956. But it's too bad I don't really know because the fake news move really played into that, and I think it would be Pollyannish of me, to deny that there has been a crisis in journalism, because I think there have been some real ethical lapses on the part of major, really important news organizations in response to Trumpism. And no one's really ever been held to account for those. But I just think it's not, I don't know, it's like, you can't just, it's on you. I'm sorry, Bob. But it is kind of like it's on you to figure it out.
Good answer. Great answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Rick Zangler from Guilford, and it's probably a dumb question, but in your opening remarks you talked about, or you mentioned television as a public utility, and suddenly I thought, why isn't the internet a public utility? Could that happen? And it's not your role to say how that can happen, but the fact that it's not a public utility strikes me as being very important. I wondered if you could comment on that.
Okay. Yeah, I absolutely can, but I'm also going to ask the microphone guy. This is going to annoy you all so much. I don't take more than 2 questions from men in a row. So that was 3. I figure you guys can have twice as many questions, but you can't have 3 times as many. Because here's what happens. Men ask first, women sort of wait around, I'm not being essentialist, and see like what the question vibe is, and then they raise their hand, and then the question's over. So you feel like if you wait, so please we need to hear from someone. But that is a fantastic question, thank you for that. And if you get to the end of these truths, I answer that question. So here's what happened. Herbert Hoover was the Secretary of Commerce in the 1920s. Look, it's going to be a really long answer. And the guy was kind of a genius. And he was an engineer, as you may know. And he was also an expert in efficiency. And he saw radio coming, and he had these annual conferences on radio. And no one really knew what radio was going to be. It was just going to be like ship to shore, like it was a cool thing, but like that it would be broadcast. Only really, Hoover was one of the few people who was paying enough attention to it. So he had these annual conferences at the White House. So by the time commercial radio was really available, he was way out ahead of it. He knew everybody at RCA, like he really thought about it. He thought about its possibility. And he had this whole, everybody who comes up with a new communications technology is like, it will make us one people. And it doesn't work, but that's what they all think. And he thought that. So he thought in order for that to work, a more perfect union kind of thing, the government had to be sure to license radio frequencies. And that they had to have some rules for what you could put on the radio. And he would be really careful because remember, like, we're in Weimar, Germany at this point, but like, radio also was conceivably very, very dangerous, right? Like, and it was incredibly dangerous when Hitler came to power. And, you know, everybody in Germany had to have a radio. And Goebbels had like a button on his desk and he could just press it. And this is, you know, this is where Orwellianism comes from. He would press it and everybody had to turn on their radio and listen to what Goebbels had to say. Like, Hoover kind of anticipated some of that. He's like, we need to have a different system. We're going to have a licensing system. We're going to have public interest requirements. There has to be a frequency that's dedicated to public interest programming. We're going to require equal airtime for people with different political positions. Like, all that stuff was set up with the Federal Radio Act of 1927, which was then renewed and extended with the founding of the FCC in 1934, the Federal Communications Act, which it sets up what becomes the Fairness Doctrine, which is the set of rules around, like, if you have to give people equal time. You can't say a bunch of stuff about somebody. I couldn't go on the air and say Paul Hines is blah 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 blah. Like they would have you have to call Paul Hines and say Lepore's going to say Paul Hines that you're a bad dog owner, and you know and you have to be given a chance to say no, I take my dog for a walk every morning, and he comes to the office with me. Whatever, like you have to like the standard of reply, a right to reply, like all these things that are kind of part of broadcasting rules or are meant to be. Those kind of come out of looking ahead to the technology. So what happens with the internet is not Herbert Hoover is in charge, it's Newt Gingrich. So in the 1990s, Gingrich is in love with all these futurists who are talking, they know the internet is about to become open to commercial traffic. It's, you know, the internet begins in like the 1960s, early 1970s. By 1971, ARPANET is sending messages. So people have been waiting for this and waiting for this. And most of them are libertarians. And Gingrich is like, oh, you know what we're going to do here? We just finally, in 1987, with Reagan, got rid of the Fairness Doctrine, which, you know, people argued Reagan didn't. It wasn't really Reagan's fault, but like some people thought it was really suppressing the conservative insurgency. So we finally got rid of the Fairness Doctrine. Now we can have cable news. We've got Rush Limbaugh. We've got everything we want. We have Fox News. We have MSNBC. All these things are coming on cable. We have this new, we want the internet to follow that model. Anything goes. It's leave me alone libertarianism. And so what we have with the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which is pretty much drafted by a Gingrich think tank called the Progress and Freedom Foundation, is the Section 230 stuff that people have followed. And we're like, I don't want to go into Section 230, but you know, the idea is what we really need, what a free press will look like is the government has no role. So there would have been, and Bill Clinton completely went along with this. Bill Clinton, he signs the thing. This is why, remember how Al Gore said he invented the internet? It's because of this, Al Gore's role in this. Like the kind of, what were they called? The New Something Democrats, the New Democrat of the Deal.
The New Democrats, I think.
They're the New Democrats or whatever. They had the Democratic Leadership Council. These people are all like willing, they believe in, they're all Google-eyed about these futurists too. And they're, I don't know, there just wasn't a vision, a looking ahead vision. And as in the, you know, Congress doesn't work anymore. So to overrule that Telecommunications Act, Congress would actually have to be willing to pass legislation instead of, spend other days trying to raise money and wait for the next executive order that they can complain about, or the next Supreme Court decision that they can raise money over. Like, Congress does nothing. So you would need to have a Congress that worked for that. But, and also, it's like, if Hoover hadn't done that, what would radio have become? Okay, I'm sorry, that was really too long.
Thank you very much.
No, I already gave you this. You're on the winning side so far.
My name's Dan Graham, and I'm a trustee here at the Manchester Library, and I'm a journalist. And I have to crack up because I was born in 1956, and I think about that a lot. And the question that I was thinking of even before you brought it up was, I was thinking about the challenges of the citizen and the news we choose. And I have thought about that a lot because I like to read as widely as possible, but I also find that the fragmentation of the media is not even just the media, it's the medium. So it's become so overwhelming.
Yeah.
And so I have my own strategies for figuring out how to parse an issue or get to the bottom of something, but I was curious, how you think about that and what you could advise us as active citizens who want to know what's going on and want to make good judgments.
Yeah. We're all in the same boat there. So I don't mean to diminish it as it's very hard, and it's not a thing you can do and then check it off your list, because everything's always changing. I felt like I had figured out a decent news diet for myself. And then now I have ChatGPT on my what is the bar called?
Chiron.
No, your dashboard thing. Your tool, whatever. I could just go ask ChatGPT stuff, and it's just lying to me all the time. Just make stuff up. So, but it's so easy to ask. I have to not ask it things that involve. It also is just terrible at the news, but. I learned for the first time reading something recently that there's this process this phenomenon known as inversion. And it means when a source of information, people participating in a communications technology are outnumbered by the robots participating in it. So Twitter has become inverted. So there are more robots on Twitter than people. They're just bots who are sending out likes and retweeting things or whatever. So I think a good rule would be don't participate in something that's inverted. And maybe to keep an eye out on that as a phenomenon that we haven't really thought about yet. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on any social media. I've said this in public many times, and I will say it again. I think social media is a catastrophe for humanity. So I think it's going to be a hard thing to recover from. But here's what I like. You will like this. I like an editorial board. I really like a publication with smart people making editorial decisions about it. What I don't like about how can I tell? I am not a good editorial board. I don't want to be my own editorial board. Because if I make it my job, because it is my job, but it's not my job to redo everybody's research. My job is to look for news organizations with very smart editorial boards who are making good decisions. And I honestly really believe in subscription. I believe in finding news organizations with good editorial boards, good writers, fine. It's how people say smart is cheap, but competent is really valuable? You don't need the smartest plumber, you need the plumber who shows up. I don't need the most brilliant writing, swaggery, interesting, Tom Wolfe of the moment or something. I need a good editorial board that makes good choices about what to cover, how to cover it, does the good job, finds good writers. So that's why, like, I'm not kidding. I'm like, I don't go do fundraising events for other organizations. Like, I really believe it's something like the Digger, like, where they're just trying to do the job. And so that otherwise, what would I be doing? I'd be like trying to page through the, the Free Press, the Brattleboro Reformer. Has there been a story about, this thing going on? Who's covering the flooding in Vermont? Did anybody in the Times have a story about that? Did they send up some stringer who's never been to Vermont before? Like, I don't know. But look, here's this news organization that has an editor who's making good decisions. Good, I'm done. Now I know I'm done for now. Like, I have to wait because maybe, maybe something else is coming along. Like, it's an active process. And I would say that a thing I also would warn about, in addition to inversion, because if you're participating in a thing where there are more robots than humans, I can't even go there to talk about that. But there's also a kind of drift. So I've definitely noticed that news organizations whose publications I really respected and admired have drifted and lost their way. And I have to be really careful about having them be like a main source of news about something. So that's the kind of vigilance I think that is required. Yeah, in my own, like, how do I get to the bottom of something is also different because it's my job. So I don't know that there's more to say than that. Yeah.
Thank you. It sounds like we have time for maybe one more question. How about two? Let's do two more questions. Dustin, do you mind?
Hi, I'm curious if there's any way to know whether organizations like VTDigger and ProPublica are shifting some people's sense of the legitimacy of those news organizations and shifting readership by covering local news so that someone who is covered in a fair and accurate report for something that's happening in their local community suddenly has a light bulb go off and say, like, oh, this is a news source that is fair and accurate, unlike the other ones that I have been reading.
Could I ask Jill and then Sky to answer that question? Well, all right, we'll go to Sky first, and then if you're willing.
Sure. No, that's a great question. There was a study that in communities where local news has gone away, the readers and the people who live in that community, it's not like they go to the next county's local news. What they do is then go to national news. And national news is more distilled often and doesn't necessarily have reporters in the community. When you are reading local news and you're reading a non-controversial story, you're seeing somebody cover the Little League game, you were there, you saw the same game, you see the reporter, and they're telling the story that you saw. So that does build trust. And then when that same reporter covers a contentious select board meeting where there's something in town that folks disagree on, and that same reporter is telling that news, that does really help build the trust. So local news really is important to not only building trust, but to fostering that kind of dialogue that helps take the temperature down and helps us have healthy civil discourse versus just shouting at each other.
I would also just add, I thought it was really interesting to hear earlier Jill say that it was actually Digger's coverage of COVID that got her reading our news organization. And we found that was actually the case for many, many Vermonters. For a time, VTDigger began, of course, with investigative journalism and then State House coverage. And for a time, it was very Montpelier focused. Eventually, Ann Galloway, the founder, really realized that it needed to expand beyond that, it needed to get out into communities across the state. And among the early hires was Southern Vermont reporters, because she recognized that it was really important to be really outside of Montpelier. But it was COVID that introduced Digger to a whole nother group of readers. They were people who were not necessarily as interested in reading about state policy or whatever. They just wanted to know, where can I get the vaccine? Or, how can I do this? How can I keep my family safe, keep myself safe? I think the organization sort of learned through that process that, and it's kind of obvious, but it took that happening for the organization to realize how important it was to provide that real-time information about how you can, protect yourself, your family, et cetera. And that's a lesson that we took from COVID to the flooding last summer, and then the flooding this summer, where we had this, in the middle of these great tragedies, we had an opportunity to provide information that was quick, it was easy to obtain, it was factual, or at least as factual as it could be in the moment. And in some cases, we think it was life-saving. Some of our early stories, particularly in last summer's flooding, we were among the first people to really write about this ahead of time and to allow people to prepare and get ready for the storms to come. So I think that's another way that news organizations can build trust, and hopefully that has some greater effect than just on our own. Unless, do you want to add anything, Jill? Or? Okay, Dustin, can you find one more excellent question, and then we will wrap it up?
My name is Jillian Joyce, and I am a member of the Social Studies Department at the local high school down the road. And this fall, I find myself teaching government, so it's fascinating and exciting. But the students come with a lot of sort of not just like real skepticism of what is working. So I wonder, as a teacher, also, how do you get students to believe and buy in that, like, what is the way forward? What is there here to be kind of hopeful and sustaining this? We all, every generation thinks they live in unprecedented times, but just in this moment, how do you get that buy-in?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. More challenging with high schoolers or junior high schoolers, I'm sure. I would say the most fun I've ever had teaching and that's always a good sign that things are working, was a couple years ago. I used to teach this class called the Democracy Project. And so it's self-selecting. I mean, I guess these kids who are going to take the class think there is such a thing as democracy, and it is a project. But it also fulfilled a requirement that was otherwise kind of tough to knock off before graduation. So I had like a lot of second semester seniors who were not necessarily interested. So we did this semester-long project where I said, look, the Constitution has not been meaningfully amended since 1971. And that's like my lifetime. And that's kind of a bummer if you believe in change, because fundamental change requires constitutional amendment. Other kinds of constitutional change requires going to the Supreme Court, which can reverse itself. So this is a source of tremendous political instability in polarized times. That the only meaningful way to change the Constitution is to go to 9 justices, and it's a problem. I've written this long book that's coming out next year that's about the nature of this problem. So I said, let's just try to amend the Constitution this semester. So like the very first class meeting, I had the students write down 10 things that they wanted to change about the Constitution, which was funny because, of course, nobody knows anything about the Constitution anyway. So it was like people had these crazy ideas. I'm like, well, that's already in there. Also, that would just require a law, So that was fun, just learning about. But then I put them in groups, and they were all going to be caucuses, whose job was to research and properly draft a proposed amendment. So there was an education caucus, a voting rights caucus, a term limits caucus, like that. Because they just I clustered them around their interests. And so all semester they had to meet in these little caucus groups and work on a white paper and the text of a constitution. And then they had all these little things to do, because their argument for the need for this amendment had to be historical, because it was fulfilling a history requirement. So not a government requirement, but you could use it. It's a twofer. So we did these kind of things where they had to get a bunch of people to sign a petition for this amendment, and they had to get I don't know, 5 grad students, 5 faculty members, 5 students, 5 non-Harvard people, 5 people from Cambridge that weren't in their own family. Just like a bunch of tasks. But they had to like go talk to people. They had to make a campaign video for their amendment. Anyway, the hardest thing for them to do was, I had a bunch of people be the Rules Committee. And I had said to the Rules Committee, you have to make it really hard to amend the Constitution, because of course it's impossible. So they came up with all these rules for the Constitutional Convention that were really tough. Like you could only vote for so many other amendments besides your own. And you could form coalitions with other caucuses, but you also had to oppose, like you could only like belong to 3 coalitions, and you only had like 5 votes you could give in favor of an amendment. There were 15 amendments on the table. In other words, they had to make really hard choices about what they cared about, and they had to be willing to give up something of what they, like if I said to you, oh, you're in the Voting Rights Caucus, Paul, and you believe in felon enfranchisement, but my group doesn't really believe in that. But on the other hand, if you support us, we'll support you. So you know, we will come to a new deal around felon. Like they're terrible at coming to compromise. This is what the problem with the party system at the moment. So anyway, when we had we didn't have a final exam. The final exam was the convention. And the Rules Committee was in charge, and they sat in the front of the room, and they had a gavel, and it was awesome. And I sat there in the corner with my TFs, and we just watched them have this convention for like 3 hours, where, you know, they got out, the Rules Committee were just tyrants. Like, they had so many rules about procedure. And, like, you couldn't amend the amendment, and it was unbelievable. And it was the best, like, final exam I ever gave. And I think it was, like, the best final exam they ever took. So I do think, like, because it was about, imagine if you could fix something that really bugs you. And it wasn't because you were going to just tweet about it all day or tell your roommate you thought that was stupid, or the person who believed the other thing was a dipshit. Like, you had to actually collaborate with a group of students, research it, get support, make real compromises, make hard choices. They did find out that it was very difficult to amend the Constitution, but at the last minute, this is my last thing I'll say about this, the Rules Committee had like this killer backup plan because only one amendment passed the threshold. You could vote as individuals, but then your delegates voted too, so it was like a federalism model, like states versus, and they had a backup plan which was to adjust the rules, so in the end they're like, we're going to have a floor vote, call for a floor vote, and they voted to adjust the rules, and so 3 of the amendments passed. And then people were like, that's the best thing that ever happened somehow. We did it!
That's amazing. Well, I wish I had been in that class. That sounds pretty amazing. Definitely would have caught my attention. I'm going to hand the microphone back to Sky for last couple of words, and thank you, Jill, so much. We really appreciate you being here.
Such great questions. Thank you, everyone. That was so engaging and interesting. We forgot earlier to thank GNAT for filming this evening. Thank you so much. Eventbrite, we'll be following up with you with a link probably next week so you can rewatch this evening and share it with your friends. As we wrap up, and I'm told the library closes at 7, so fairly soon, I hope you are feeling as inspired as I am from this evening. As we've said a couple of times, Digger doesn't have a paywall because we really believe that all Vermonters, regardless of their ability to pay for a newspaper subscription, should have access to the information that they need to make informed decisions about their lives and their communities. And over the past quarter century, the University of Vermont just released a study that 75% of newspaper jobs in Vermont have gone away. Yeah, it's very, very scary. And Vermonters are continually turning to Digger to fill those gaps. We have the passion, we have the expertise, we have the desire to better and more fully serve Vermonters and cover more stories. But what we don't have is the financial resources to meet all the needs. And that's where you come in. So I'd like to ask each of you, what kind of meaningful contribution can you make to ensure that all Vermonters have free and equal access to Digger's reporting? You can scan our QR code, you can get in touch with Dustin, you can talk to any of our board members, you can talk to me to learn more about how you can fund this critical work. And we can continue together to build a stronger democracy for everyone who cares about Vermont. Our enormous, enormous thanks to Jill this evening.